Kia ora, everyone. My name is Andrea, as most of you will know who joined us before, and a very warm welcome to those who haven't joined us before in this wonderful webinar series that we are doing since, I think, March maybe. During lockdown we started it, and it's all part of our booklets, our booklet series called Progressive Thinking, and we have published a number of books on texts on housing and on the future of work. And we had planned before lockdown to do another booklet on the future of public and community services. And because of lockdown, we couldn't publish, but we thought we'll make the chapters available online and do webinars instead of lunchtime seminars that we usually do. So this has become a bit of a thing, and we are doing one webinar per week until September. So if you're enjoying this, please do join us again next time. And of course, you'll find all the previous booklets on our website online, and you can download them and have a read if you're interested in those. Just a quick run through how we are going to run the webinar. Very easy, very straightforward. We'll do a bit of an introduction of our guest, and then our guest will present his chapter. And then, as always, we'll have a bit of a conversation, and I would like to encourage you all to participate in the chat and to use the question and answer function, the Q&A function, to post your questions for Geoff. And please try to keep them reasonably short, because that makes it easier to build it into our conversation and easier to identify what you're really after, what the core is. Our guest we probably, from experience from past webinars, we didn't get through all of the questions that you are asking. So our guest will most likely, I hope you're available for that, Geoff, answer some questions after the webinar, as other guests have done in the past. So yeah, I think that's probably all from me. We keep it nice and short. So I'd love to welcome our guest today, which is Geoff Bertram. Geoff is a senior associate with the Institute for Governance and Policy Studies. And I would like to mention that Geoff has a website where he makes all his work available, and that is actually wonderful. So if you're interested in other topics that he has written on, over his long career, you can check it out there and download the documents from his website. As always, Geoff and I had a quick chat prior to the webinar, and Geoff told me that he's old, retired, and argumentative. So that makes for a good start to the webinar. Geoff, explain a little bit about yourself and what you mean by your characteristics that you shared with me.
Right. When I say I'm old, that means I was born in the Second World War. I grew up in the 1950s and 60s. I'm a child of the New Zealand mixed economy and welfare state of the mid-20th century. And my ideas, therefore, were formed to a large extent in that context. And that was partly in the context of a government that ran in the old way, the pre-1980s way. And if you find that I exhibit a bit of nostalgia for that, I make no apology for that. There were some bad things about the old system, but there were many good things about it as well. And I think if you don't learn from your history and look at the way historical problems were solved by previous generations, you can miss out on a lot of important ideas for how we could be running things in the future. So that's to do with old. Retired, I no longer teach. I do still carry out research. I'm still active in debate and so on. But my career as an economics teacher is now 10 years behind me. And so if you find that I haven't actually got up with the very latest relevant journal article in public economics, I apologize. I will be referring to one or two articles from the last 30, 40 years, including one from 3 years ago. But I am less on the pace, if you like, than perhaps I might once have been. And as for argumentative, I'm engaged in policy debate on a variety of fronts. It's well known that I am a strong critic of the electricity restructuring since 1986, and I'm still a critic of the industry's current performance. I'm critical of the way the Commerce Act and the Commerce Commission have operated. I think we've had a major failing on the antitrust front. I'm critical of the emissions trading scheme, which I regard as a crock that needs to be either completely rethought or else replaced. So that my recent couple of pieces on the public sector should be seen in the context that I have a habit of getting on the wrong side of arguments. And so for that reason, I am very largely an outsider observing from outside the system. I'm not somebody who is on the quangos, who is involved in the institutional development, nor am I an inside player in political debate and discussion. I'm an academic and I stand outside, and that gives me the advantage, I guess, of a perspective on things, but it gives me the disadvantage that I don't actually know the detail of the inside story. And so I'm sure that you will, many of you, be feeling that as I go through what I have to say.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. Thank you. That's great. And what you just touched upon is sort of reflected, I guess, in your chapter as well. You're talking about the Ministry of Works and if we should revive it. So a real kind of thought-provoking chapter about connecting the past with the present, if you like, or learn from the past. So the floor is yours. I'm very excited to hear what you have to say, and surely our participants as well. So around about, 10, 15 minutes, and then we'll have a bit of a conversation about it.
Okay. And just to start with, I'm going to put up a slide, which I hope will give you an outline of where I'm going with this. I have essentially 5 headings under which I wanted to talk today. The first one is to identify the problem that's been interesting me. That is that the elected government doesn't seem able to deliver effectively on quite a lot of the promises it makes or the aspirations that it has. And the political story is, of course, to blame the government, but I'm interested in the actual functional detail of why it is that what people at the top of the system want to happen often doesn't actually come out of the front line. And I see this as the result of 2 things, both of which are inherent in the way the New Zealand state sector was restructured after 1987. One thing is a disconnect in the chain of command from the centre to the front line, and the other thing is perverse incentives inside the public service that mean that the operation doesn't hang together quite as well as I think it might and should. So I then wanted to talk about some hardcore economics, since one has to bring, I guess, some gritty stuff into a discussion like this. And so there are 4 other authors in the economics literature that I wanted to refer to. The first is Ronald Coase in a 1937 article about why firms exist in a capitalist economy. And I want to generalize Coase's insights to apply to other things that you find in a capitalist or any sort of market economy, lumps that exist within the sea of competitive activity, and the reason why those lumps are there. I wanted to talk about Oliver Hart, who had got the Nobel Prize 3 or 4 years ago for his work on incomplete contracts, to talk about why contracting, when it's incomplete, can give you all sorts of unintended consequences. I wanted to mention Klein and Alkin's 1978 paper, which looks at the post-contractual opportunism area, the extent to which once you've signed a contract with an outside provider, you are at their mercy, and the ways in which you can avoid getting into that situation. And finally, there's the public choice theories of Buchanan and Tulloch, which led to the new public management reorganisation of the New Zealand public sector. And then, having covered that theoretical core, I hope quickly, I wanted to talk about the Public Works Department, the Ministry of Works, and the world that we live in now, where we don't have a Ministry of Works anymore. And as a result, the government does not have in-house capability to actually go and build things or to deliver really hard-hitting engineering assessments of what it is that we need to build even. And finally, a few words about the difference between thinking big and thinking. We're very prone in New Zealand to think big because it excites politicians. We're very reluctant often to actually think because it runs us into confronting difficult and hard choices in a systematic way. And so that's a word or two about planning procedures. Okay, so let me start off with a little bit about the problem that I see. If you've watched Cinda Ardern and Ashley Bloomfield briefing us on the progress with the COVID crisis, you will have been familiar with the problem that has come up. Do we have PPE available everywhere? Yes, we do, because we've told people to make it available, but back come the media reports, no, it's not available. Here's somebody who doesn't have it, here's somebody who doesn't have it, here's some agency that thinks you don't need it. There's a disconnect shows up. The same thing came about with the border organisation. The government was clear what it wanted to do in terms of isolation and quarantine. The outcome was a bit different for quite a while because it took a long time to get everybody on the same page in terms of what had to be done, who had which roles, how to respond to contingencies that hadn't been foreseen, and so on. Elsewhere across the landscape, we find the same sort of thing going on. The Transmission Gully project in Wellington is one that's in the headlines at the moment. It's a public-private partnership. Delivery of the road depends upon the performance by a contracting party that's actually an offshore company and has all the incentives to screw us over, and is proceeding to do so. And it's doing so in a context where sorting it out through the courts is going to be a lengthy and painful process. The incentive for politicians is to push through and simply spend money to overcome the problems that they've encountered. But the problems have arisen largely because of the contracting difficulties that have arisen by using outside providers to construct a major piece of infrastructure. And that's going to bring me back around to the problem of not having a Ministry of Works within the government system. And you can see a whole lot of other areas where we've had worries about using outsourced providers for government services. The Serco performance as an operator of prisons a few years ago was another classic. And the Simpson review of the health systems organisation, what we should do about the district health boards and so on, is the latest of a whole series of initiatives that think that by tinkering with the organisational detail, you can somehow improve performance. Whereas when really the issue that we have seen is one of a disconnect between what the public want and the politicians say they're going to give, but what can actually deliver out of the processes that are embedded in the institutions that we have. So that leads me to two central elements in the 1987 reorganisation of the New Zealand public sector. One of them is the funder-provider split, and the other one is the new public management. The funder-provider split originates from the idea that government should be small rather than big. It does have a background in Hayekian dislike of the large state and a desire to cut back the size of the state, and to cut back the size of the state while still delivering the things that we rely on a state to deliver. A new set of relationships had to be set up where central ministries declared what outputs they wanted to obtain, and ideally what outcomes would flow from those, and then looked to private sector or autonomous government sector agencies to do the actual work, deliver the goods, and there would be a funding arrangement, a contractual arrangement between the two, so that the provider would be at arm's length from the funding policy making part of the operation. Now, to make that work, you require some quite strong prerequisites, and New Zealand did not put those prerequisites in place as part of its public sector reforms. You need a contracting process that is as complete as possible, so that all the unforeseeable contingencies are covered one way or another, in a way that does not expose the taxpayer to being the ultimate carrier of the burden of failure. And incompleteness of contracts, I'll come back to in a minute, is a fundamental problem for the funder-provider split model. Second part of the problem is that communication between the funder and the provider, once you've put it into a formalized contractual process, becomes degraded. The incentives on the provider party is to try to tick all the necessary boxes to get the funding continued, but not necessarily to keep the funder completely fully informed of exactly what is going on down there. And the funder's incentive is to cover their ass and not be accountable for any of the bad outcomes that you see down at the front line. So we've had a system where the funder has seen its role as minimizing the amount of funding. It's been a cost-cutting exercise, and the provider has seen it as a matter of trying desperately to maximize their apparent productivity in order to keep the funder happy. And that is not a productive way to run the sort of services that we are trying to deliver in the name of the public of New Zealand under a democratic system of accountability. And it does mean that ministers have been able to escape what otherwise might well be the legitimate expectation of accountability. So the funder-provider split is the first part of the problem that I see. And the second part of the problem that I see is the new public management arrangement, where we moved from having specialist departments which were headed by people who knew the business from the ground up, who had come through the department, moved on to become the head of the ministry or the department, were known within the department, knew the culture, knew the business, and understood the problems, and so could give free and frank advice to ministers based upon deep experience and institutional memory. We took that away and we moved to a managerial model that brought in outsiders on short-term contracts, not familiar with the detailed on-the-ground specifics of the ministry's business, and then expected them to get on top of quite complicated issues and to be able to channel free and frank advice up from the department to the minister in a way that was constructive rather than defensive. And the instinct within a managerial system is defensive. It is cover my ass, make sure that I don't get into awkward positions. And from the minister's point of view, there's a defensive reaction. As much as possible, let me blame the department for operational failings and stand well back from them myself. And that led to things like, for example, Helen Clark's no surprises policy, which still applies, which I think is a serious constraint on what ought to be the way that a properly run government operates. So a couple of bits of economics that I wanted to just quickly alert you to in these areas. The first one, the funder-provider split, is really a matter of outsourcing. It's a question of how you deal with the question, should I make something or should I buy it? And the make or buy decision is one that all firms in a capitalist economy have faced, and it's one that government agencies face as well. Is it better to make something myself or to go out and buy it on the open market? And the big contribution made by Ronald Coase back in 1937, when he wrote his article on the nature of the firm, was to say the reason firms exist at all is to take a whole lot of transactions away from the market and organize them, directly. So the firm is a little island of planning, where you don't obey the logic of open markets and the price mechanism. You actually make decisions about how the group is to be organized, what it is to do, how it is to be done. And so within the firm, a whole lot of transactions go on which are not market driven. And at the boundaries of the firm, there is an interaction with the wider market system, where you buy and sell at the prices determined on the market. When you extend that to other institutions, you see the same set of calculations. The family, for example, is not a market operation. It is separated from the market. It deals with the market at the boundaries, but within the family, decisions are taken and resources are allocated on the basis of the values and logic and desires of that family group. When you do it with a government department, the same applies. The department has the choice between doing things itself or going and buying the services of some outside party to do it. And Kosa's point was the optimal size of the firm is determined by the amount to which, the degree to which it's better to make stuff yourself in-house than to go out and buy it in. And there is a lot of stuff that is most sensibly done in-house, partly because it just gives you a direct handle on what goes on, partly because it gives clear accountability for who actually made the decision and is responsible for the outcomes, and partly, very importantly, I think, because of the learning by doing that's involved. When you actually have to supply something yourself, you get to understand the process by which it's delivered, and you get to understand what the issues are, the problems are that arise. And all of that is really valuable, built into institutional memory and institutional knowledge, and it improves the quality of decision making at the top end of the organisation. You can see me moving here towards the argument for the Ministry of Works, that the problem we've encountered once we'd abolished the Ministry of Works is that government departments, which increasingly have no engineers in them and have no engineering expertise in them, are asked to do big decisions about infrastructure without a knowledge base of their own. So they hire consultants in who can give conflicting advice of unknown quality, and they bring outside suppliers in to construct the works. And in both cases, they're left exposed to hold up subsequently. Once the contract is signed, the contractor who's building the project knows perfectly well that the government can't do it itself. It hasn't got what we call an outside option of simply cancelling the contract and doing the work itself. If Transmission Gully is taken over by NZTA, it's not as if NZTA can simply whistle out there and deploy its own teams of engineers and contractors and machinery. It's going to have to go and find other parties to do the work for it. So the advantage that the Ministry of Works in its day brought to the government was the ability as their default option to say, we can always do this ourselves. You know, if we can find somebody outside to do it better, cool. If they fail, we can go back and do it ourselves. That outside option is what has been removed from us now. Now, the outside option is whether we come to the Klein and Alkin's 1978 paper about what they call post-contractual opportunism. If you enter into a contract with another party, you are always exposed to them failing to deliver unless you always have a solid option that enables you to switch immediately and at minimum cost to some other way of doing things. And that was where the Ministry of Works was always potentially an outside option. If we'd kept it going and had gone to contracting out, we could always have been able to say, well, if you guys can't do it, hey, we'll just call in our own people. Then we come to incomplete contracts, which is the Hart piece. And I think Oliver Hart's work is really important for you to understand. He got a Nobel Prize for writing a series of papers about the completeness or incompleteness of contracts. And it's important to understand that when people designed the funder-provider split, they thought, I suspect, that contracts would be complete, that somehow public service people would be able to enter into contracts which would be highly sophisticated, cover all the contingencies, guarantee performance, have effective sanctions if performance was not delivered. And I just wanted to read you a little passage from Hart's 2017 piece, with the lecture he gave when he got the Nobel Prize. He says, complete contracts are contracts where everything that can ever happen is written into the contract. There may be some incentive constraints from moral hazard or asymmetric information, but there are no unanticipated contingencies. But actual contracts are not like this, and lawyers have known this for a long time. Actual contracts are poorly worded, ambiguous, leave out important things, are incomplete, And the critical question that arises with an incomplete contract is who has the right to decide about the missing things. We call this right the residual control or the decision right. The question is who had it. And the further thought led us to the idea that this is what ownership is about. All right. So to the extent that you have ownership of the process and the project, you have the residual control. And the residual control is absolutely critical. By contracting out by the funder-provider split, the government, the central government abdicates from responsibility and at the same time loses the residual control right. It surrenders that to the other contracting party. And the result is, with incomplete contracts, the taxpayers will continually find themselves being disappointed or asked to pick up the tab for failings down the track. And the solution to that is either to go to complete contracts, which are not feasible in the real world, or to, in some way, retain the ownership, the residual control rights for the delivery of central decisions. And that means a much more integrated, vertically integrated supply chain where decisions at the centre are directly transmitted through to the front line, and accountability for the outcomes goes right back up to the centre. And that was more or less the way we used to run the public service before 1987. We had specialist departments whose managers were professionals developed within the department, skilled in the issues that the department encountered, and those departments would have ownership in the really important sense of the particular area that they were responsible for some part of social policy, some for education, for health, whatever it might be. Ownership would be well defined and well controlled, and at the top of the system would be people who understood what ownership meant and were prepared to exercise the necessary decision-making authority that went with that. Now, so
maybe a couple more minutes, Geoff.
Yeah, so let me talk a bit about
a number of questions.
Brings me back to the Ministry of Works. If you go all the way back to when we started this off, the 1870s, you may be familiar with the Vogel government. The Vogel government was extremely keen on getting infrastructure going in New Zealand, building railways and so on, railways especially. And so in the 1870s, 1876, the Public Works Department was set up, and its job was to go out and build things. It was to have the engineers, the labourers, the machinery, all the gear, and it went out and it did indeed build roads, railways, hydroelectric dams, all sorts of the infrastructure that today we take for granted in New Zealand. And in the 1940s, it mutated into the Ministry of Works, which lasted until 1988. It was a government department that undertook construction, which also undertook regulation. It looked after the regulation of building codes and so on. It provided an enormous amount of training for New Zealand engineers. And so from the Ministry of Works, engineers went out into the private sector with a lot of background knowledge. It also conducted, unfortunately, I think, the planning machinery under the Town and Country Planning Act, which meant that within the same organisation, you had the planning decisions being made and the implementation, and that was a conflict of interest, which in the end sank the Ministry of Works, because when Think Big came in the 1970s, Muldoon and Birch called on the Ministry of Works both to give the approvals for the projects and to go and build the projects. And that conflict produced in the 1980s the breaking out of planning into the RMA, and the elimination of the Ministry of Works itself as its reputation went downhill following cost overruns at Rangipo and Clyde and very, very heavy criticism from within the Treasury. So when I think we think about restoring the Ministry of Works, bringing back that capability within the public sector, it's really important that we keep separate from that the actual making of decisions on what projects are to proceed and under what terms. And that's a big warning that I'd put up if we did revive the ministry, that we have to have a better operating strengthened resource management act machinery in place. Okay, so there I've run over my time, but let's sit back and do questions.
No, fabulous. Thank you so much. Really, really interesting. And I think quite a few people are actually aware of the Ministry of Works and are very familiar with it, but others aren't. So thanks for sharing those thoughts. That's fabulous. And I would like to start with a question which came in earlier on, and it's actually quite a high-level question, but I think it sets the frame for what you are suggesting. It asks, are we today thinking big enough? You know, we might think in small categories. We are not ambitious enough. What do you think about that, actually? And what needs to change in order to be able to think big and really do things differently, transform the public and community system? One, of course, answer to that would be a Ministry of Works. Is that part of big thinking?
Not necessarily, no. A Ministry of Works is to do with big doing, not big thinking.
I love
In
it.
other words, it's to do with the actual on-the-ground delivery of stuff and doing that efficiently and within engineering parameters and all of that sort of thing. But that's not what I call thinking big. I think there are two sorts of thinking big. And one of them is, I think, very dangerous, and one of them is really important. We do the dangerous one, and we don't do the important one in New Zealand. And that has been the case now for decades. The dangerous sort of thinking big is politicians seeing some wonderful, big, shiny project and locking onto it and saying, wow, let's do this, and mustering votes and whipping up a great deal of fervour and describing that as thinking big. Muldoon and Bill Birch back in the 1970s had a whole raft of projects that they got excited about, you know, the Pukenga urea plant and the new aluminium smelter and the New Zealand Steel Works, you know, and on it went. And they locked onto these because they could sell them politically as being signs that they were thinking big. And now we have Shane Jones and Phil Twyford and other ministers getting excited about projects because they're big. Shane Jones, for example, in his ongoing campaign to shift the Port of Auckland up to Marsden Point. I mean, that's the sort of think big that I have in mind, where you seize upon some particular project as the silver bullet that's going to rescue you.
Do you actually get to talk to those ministers?
It's really dangerous. What?
Do you get to talk to those ministers? Do you get a chance to actually share your ideas at the top level? I
haven't had a talk to the current lot, but back in the day when Muldoon and Birch were doing their thinking big, I was one of the core group of the Coalition for Open Government, which was not the non-government opponents of Think Big and of the National Development Act of 1978, where you spent 5 years intensively debating with the government the nuts and bolts of the Think Big project and the program and the things that were wrong about it. But let me move from the dangerous thinking big to the important thinking big. The important thinking big is what we call planning. In other words, it is putting down, you know, in a clear, rigorous economic and social framework, the way that the things you want to achieve and the pathways that may enable you to achieve them. And planning since the 1980s has had a really, really bad name in New Zealand. The New Zealand government has simply lost the ability to plan. You saw this in the frustration of Rob Fife when he spent a while in the COVID crisis, you know, as part of the coordinating group trying to think ahead of the crisis. And he came out making press statements giving press interviews saying there's no plan in there. How can they do this without a plan? Well, there is no plan in there because in the 1980s we systematically destroyed the planning capability of the New Zealand government's internal agencies, and we systematically wiped out the planning capability that had been developed outside the government. So the project in economic planning at Victoria University, which I was associated with, was shut down. If that had continued, that was where you would go to think big in the sense of the economy-wide sense. The Planning Council in 1989 was shut down. That was the sort of the government's own agency that could have done this big picture thinking and put together the various parts. But now, if the minister says, I want a plan for the post-COVID economy, where do they look? Do they go to Treasury? Well, I mean, Treasury can give you a certain level of macroeconomic and fiscal thinking, but they can't give you economy-wide analysis. Do you go to the Productivity Commission? Well, unfortunately, for better or worse, the Productivity Commission simply hasn't gone down that route. It's still doing anecdotal stories about how this or that or the other thing must be the reason for our low productivity. They have not done the systematic planning type analysis. Would you go to MBIE, the Ministry for Business Innovation and Employment? No, MBIE seems unable to muster the resources together and the intellectual grunt to do economy-wide planning. And so I think this is our problem. When you don't have a planning machinery that works, the instinct is to rush off to thinking big in the dangerous sense and finding shiny things that you can sell to the electorate and promote as being your big answer to the problem. But actually the big answer to the problem lies out there very much more diverse and dispersed in the small businesses, medium level businesses, ordinary households, just the general way the New Zealand economy operates, and the tendency to pick winners and then to get in behind the winners is too often driven by the fact that the winners, that the would-be winners are noisy, effective lobbyists with good access to ministers and shout in their ear. And we just don't have the background of effective planning machinery that we need. And we can't put it together in the next month. So, you know, I'm not offering you a solution right away, but I'm certainly offering you something that should be fundamental in the next generation of public service development.
Fascinating, thank you. We have quite a few questions around contracting and I guess public-private partnerships in general. So I'm quite curious to hear, and you're pretty critical about that arrangement, and you talk about the provider-funder split as well, and we see that in the health system as well. Could you describe a little bit how the system would change and how the situation would change for people who are working in the public sector and with community organizations providing services, and those who are receiving the services, if the system avoided public-private partnerships and contracting out? If it was one integrated and fully public system, what would change?
Well, two things would change and one thing would not change. The thing that would not change is that you would from time to time use private providers. I mean, just throwing away outsourcing altogether would be nuts. Because there are plenty of skills and capabilities and so on out there in the private sector that you would want to recruit and to use. But it seems to me that you are going to need to shift quite a lot of those resources in-house rather than leaving them floating around outside the public sector. The problem then is to have a public sector in which professional, vocationally motivated providers can pursue their vocational skills and maintain their professional ethics and all of that sort of stuff without being overridden by a hierarchy of managers and supervisors who demand that they act in a particular way. Now, one place where you can see the problems of doing it not quite right, I think, is Omar Tamariki. Sorry, I didn't get the name right. But if you've been following Newsroom recently, there's a big debate going on about the extent to which social workers working with marginal families out there on the front line are working in sync with the high-level management of that government agency, whose objectives don't necessarily seem to accommodate all the professional concerns of the frontline social workers, and they're operating in a situation of very tightly constrained resources. So, as an example of how bringing things in-house and having an integrated vertical structure could go wrong on you, I think you go to look at Oranga Tamariki and think about, you know, how would you avoid getting some of those bad outcomes or dissatisfaction, shall we say, and frustration of those on the front line. But on the other hand, if you look at what can go wrong if you don't bring them in-house, you go out to the social care providers out there in the community who are on contract to companies which are on contract to other companies which are on contract to district health boards, which are on contract to the Ministry of Health, say. And that long chain of disconnection produces the other sort of frustration, where the lines of accountability and wishes and funding just don't run smoothly. So with a more integrated system, you're trying to marry the two important things. One, the ability of vocationally skilled professional providers out on the front line to do their professional thing properly with adequate funding and with support from the management structure within which they're located. And at the same time, you're wanting to make sure that the lines of accountability running right up to the ministerial level are clear and operate efficiently. And those are not easy things to put together. And the old New Zealand Public Service before the 1987 reforms had grappled with these problems and had solved some of them and not solved others of them. I'm not pretending that my nostalgia for the old system is overwhelmingly 100%. It's just that these are not new problems. We've dealt with them before, and in many ways, I think we dealt with them better in the past than we do now. So it's always worth trying to, if you have a problem with organising a particular area of the public service or a particular policy area, I think it's always going to be worth picking up the phone to any survivors from the pre-1987 departments that used to do it and say, how did you cope with this? What was the solution that you'd found? Or even worth going back and reading the old annual reports and the appendices to the journals of the House of Representatives, where you'll find many of these things being discussed.
You just
Sorry, that doesn't really answer your question, but it's an attempt.
No, that's great. That's great. You just mentioned that there will always be a certain amount of contracting. And yeah. I'm just wondering what you think about the idea, which we are discussing currently a lot, I think, and also in the past, around social and environmental procurement, using procurement as a lever to improve, working conditions, for instance, contributing to slowing down at least climate change, things like that. What are your thoughts on using procurement that way? And particularly the government, of course, using procurement that way.
I'm strongly in favour of certain sorts of procurement pressure, yes. I don't think government should contract and pay for services from any outside party that doesn't meet certain basic standards. I think that's an absolutely standard thing, that you do not contract with rat bags. You need to be certain that whoever you're actually hiring to do things for you is going to have good employment practices, pay decent wages, have reasonable environmental record, isn't in bed with particularly environmentally or socially or in some other way damaging people. You do want to be careful who you associate with, and I do think that you should be able to use the procurement power of the state as a lever. One of the things that I have suggested in the past and got myself in strife for is saying if you're going to employ an outside contractor, one of the things you would ask them is what's the ratio of the salary of their chief executive to the salary of their lowest paid worker. And if that falls outside some reasonable bounds, you would say, well, maybe we'll find somebody else whose employment practices are less skewed towards overpaying the management and underpaying the staff. But I mean, that's just one of my personal things. I got in strife for suggesting 3-to-1 would be a good ratio. I was accused of communism and all sorts of outrageous things. But I mean, in fact, my 3-to-1 suggestion came from my first job, which was as a junior lecturer in the geography department at Victoria University, where I got 1/3 the professor's salary.
I'm just checking. We have time's up, unfortunately. We have so many other very interesting questions here, but we'll pass here. 3-to-1 is fantastic. There you go. Geoff, actually quite a few comments are suggesting as well you should talk to the current government and to the ministers. People are quite supportive of your ideas. So
talk to me. That's quite
encouragement. Sorry?
They would have to want to talk to me, you know. I don't have the ability to knock on doors and just walk in.
Well, maybe we can make that happen, Geoff, huh? Well, anyway, I unfortunately have to close the webinar here, but as I said, there are a number of really interesting questions and we will get them to you, Geoff. And maybe you can make some time to reflect on them and draft some answers for people. Thank you so much for all your ideas and the history lessons, really, that you shared with us. And I would just like to briefly mention that our next webinar is next Wednesday on the 15th of July, and we are going to talk to Professor Jonathan Boston, who is you're surely familiar with, Geoff.
Oh,
and
yeah.
He will talk also about COVID and a response and the importance of public services. So yeah, it will be surely another exciting seminar. If you liked it, as always, please share with your colleagues and friends. And I finish by saying thank you and stay well.
Okay.